Chapter 6 of The Airplane Boys Among the Clouds. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Airplane Boys Among the Clouds by John Luther Langworthy. An Unknown Enemy. See there, that Mr. Marsh has got down from his machine and gone ahead to talk some more with Percy, remarked Andy as they continued to keep their eyes directed toward the road, not so very far distant where this little drama was taking place. They certainly seem to be interested in everything touching on aviation, mused Frank. Going to hang around Bloomsbury several days, are they, while their car is being overhauled? Did it look broken down to you, Larry? Almost new, replied the other readily. I'd just like to say that was only an excuse for hanging around a while. They came here on purpose, with something in their noodles, and you mark me, Frank, they don't mean to skip without having a try at that same. Well, there they go off, and the procession starts again. Percy is turning around to look after the two men, as if they interested him a heap, Andy observed. He's calling something to Sandy, but I can't make out what it is, Larry declared, for he was noted on account of his unusually keen hearing. Anyhow, they seem to be laughing and looking over this way, Frank, Andy remarked, just as if they thought they had a good joke on us. Say, do you suppose now that Mr. Marsh gave Percy a little hint he had it in for us? If he did, it would tickle that bunch to beat the band. Don't I know him, though? Never did take any stock in that conversation of Percy's. He had to say something after we got him out of the hands of the revolutionists down in Old Columbia. Well, Frank went on, there's no need of our worrying about things that may never happen. We won't cross this bridge till we get to it. But, Frank, while that sounds fine, you know right well that it's always been your way to prepare for possibilities, Andy continued positively. That's correct, and we mean to now by camping out here, Frank laughed, as if quite at his ease. Besides, we've got things fixed pretty safe by now, so that if what you thought turned out to be true, the thieves couldn't profit by anything in the line of an idea they hooked out of our shop. Those ideas are being patented and safe from the hands of a robber. Just as you say, then, Andy went on, we'll try and forget about mysterious Mr. Marsh. How's that strike you as a stunning title for our new adventure? Be off with you, Larry and Elephant. Nat would ask you to join us, but I'm afraid there wouldn't be room for so big a crowd unless you slept in my boat, which I've not had in the water this summer so far. Stammering Nat tried to answer, but knowing the uselessness of such a thing, instead he darted into the shop, took one look at the open canoe occupying slings at the further end, and then came hurrying out. He pounced on Andy, wrung his hand violently, and managed to gasp the one word, "Bully!" Then he waved his hand toward Frank and shot after the two boys who were heading for the road, anxious to return with their belongings. Within half an hour, they made their reappearance, each laden down with a bulky bundle, under which poor little Elephant seemed almost buried, though he trudged manfully along and asked no favors from his taller companions. Evening was now near. Andy had made several trips to his home beyond the border of the big field, each time returning with a load, though he and Frank had for a long time kept their cooking kit and their blankets in the shop, so that they would be handy when wanted. He had also told his father and Colonel Josiah about their intention to sleep in the workshop. Neither of the gentlemen thought anything strange of the proposition, for the bird boys were well able to look out for themselves. They had proved this so often in the past that by now Frank's father, as well as the parent of Andy, offered no objection to their projects, however bold they might appear at times. "I had your dad on the phone, Frank," Andy remarked the last time he came back. "He'd just gotten in from his round of afternoon visits, for there's a heap of sickness around Bloomsbury just now, I hear. And, of course, he said that he wouldn't worry because you stayed away for a few nights. I'll tell you, old chum, we've just got the finest governors ever. It's a lucky thing to have an obliging dad. And be able to wind him around your finger, as I hear you do yours ever since he came back from South America," laughed Frank. By the time darkness began to gather, the boys were deep in the delightful task of cooking a genuine camp supper. The stove was of generous size so that several could work around it at the same time. Andy took charge, nor would he let Frank have any hand in the proceedings, calling upon Elephant, Larry, and Nat when he needed assistance. Of course, the ham was tender, the coffee nectar fit for the gods, the Boston baked beans just as appetizing as they could possibly be, and all other things on the menu equal to any they had ever tasted. But then, hungry boys are not apt to be discriminating, save sometimes at home. Anything eaten under such romantic conditions as this was sure to be classed as prime. Larry had been as good as his word and brought back a generous donation on the part of his mother, whose doughnuts were reckoned the very best in all that section, so that they topped off a hearty supper with several of these apiece. After the aluminum cooking outfit had been thoroughly cleaned and every piece put away in its exact place, as was the custom of the Bird Boys, who could never tell just when they might want to go off in a hurry and take the camp kit along, they gathered around a table and indulged in some friendly games, Andy having been thoughtful enough to fetch these out from the house. About 10, Elephant was discovered to be fast asleep, while the others were holding a talk fest by themselves. "Time we all turned in, fellows," Frank declared after Larry had aroused his mate by tickling his ear with a straw. So, for a short time, there was much fussing and blanket turning. Finally, one by one, they announced themselves settled comfortably, Frank staying up until the last in order to put out the lamp. All of them had arranged it in case there came a sudden alarm. They would not be more than a dozen seconds getting into some clothes and their shoes so as to rush outside. There were several patent fire extinguishers handy, for the Bird Boys had had one experience with a conflagration that threatened to destroy their workshop, and with it their precious aeroplane, and they did not mean to be caught unprepared for such an emergency again. Many times during that night Frank awoke, and on each occasion he would sit up to listen. It was a quiet night, and the windows of the shop, over which heavy wire netting had been secured, were of course open, so that the air could pass on through. Thus, what sounds there might happen to arise without could be plainly heard, but the hours passed on, and there was no cause for alarm. Frank had arranged certain devices whereby he expected to be warned should anyone attempt to enter the workshop. The fine wire had been secretly carried to Andy's room in the house, where a bell would sound an alarm and arouse the sleeper. Of course, this was not wholly in use while the boys were camping there in the enclosed shed, but in its way it would prove another guardian. Once, Frank thought he heard murmuring voices. He was so impressed that he even crept out of his bed and advanced to the nearest opening, thinking to locate the speakers. Whether they proved to be Percy Carberry and his crony bent on mischief, or the mysterious Mr. Marsh and Longley spying around for some secret purpose of their own. It turned out to be only little Elephant, who was lying on his back and breathing heavily. Frank turned him over and then crept back under his blankets. So morning found them, ravenous as wolves, and each one ready with some suggestion as to what they could have for breakfast. But after all, Andy had assumed the office of high cook, and his word was law to the rank and file. He declared that codfish cakes would be a good starter, and that he had the stuff already mixed, as given him by the colored auntie in the bird kitchen. Besides that, he announced that he would treat his guests to pancakes, or, as they are always known in camp, flapjacks, which he prided himself on knowing how to make. Some honey had been smuggled over to make these more acceptable. Indeed, it would appear that Andy did know how to make light cakes, since it seemed impossible for the others to get enough of them, and he was kept over the fire until as red as a turkey cock in the face. "How about taking a turn this morning, Frank?" asked Andy, as he found himself forced in turn to cry quits with half of a flapjack still on his platter. "Don't wait to clean up, fellows," said Larry promptly. "Give the rest of us something to do while you're sailing around up among the clouds. I know just where you keep every article, and my word for it, you'll find them in place when you get back again." "That's nice of you, Larry," laughed Frank, "and I'm going to take you up on it. It does seem a shame not to take advantage of so fine a morning as this. Hardly a breath of wind as yet, you notice, and yet by noon it may be blowing great guns. You never can tell. Andy, shall we get the new machine out of the hangar?" "Oh, I'm game for anything you offer," asserted the other, getting up slowly, as became one who had just been crammed. "We tried the pontoons yesterday, and they worked as fine as silk," Frank went on to say. "Suppose we leave them off this time, as we will not be over the lake." "Just as you say," returned the willing Andy. "I tell you what, Frank, let's go up to the top of the mountains again. Haven't been there this season, you know." "Just what I had in mind myself, and I think you knew it," Frank said, as he led the way outside. "Then we might sail around over the woods up in that region where we discovered those two hiding jewelry thieves who were making headquarters of that old shack in the forest. If this biplane can climb any better than our little bug used to do, she'll be a wonder, all right. Come on and help us get things moving, fellows." Many hands made light work, and presently the biplane was ready for the start. When Frank gave the word, the others pushed her off, and as the two propellers hummed, the machine started along the ground on the 3 bicycle wheels until presently it arose in the air as gracefully as any bird could have done. "Now, which way first?" asked Andy, when the shouts of their comrades had died away in the distance, and they were half a mile from the trying out field. "I guess we'll take a little 20-mile spin first," Frank replied, moving a lever, "to see what she can do in a hurry pinch. That new engine seems to work all right, just as the smaller one did, seldom failing us. Tell me, what could be as fine as this, sailing over the earth? I don't wonder that when a fellow has once started in to be an aviator, he can't ever break away. Peril and accidents he laughs at, not because he's reckless always, but just on account of the fascination of the sport." "We're the luckiest fellows ever, just as Larry and Elephant say," Andy declared, as they soared upward and then descended in daring spirals as Frank tried out the new airship to see what it was capable of doing. In a dozen ways had it proven even more than they had expected, and both boys were wild with enthusiasm over the performance. "Let Percy come along with his new one," cried Andy, after they had volplaned successfully down toward the earth until not more than a few hundred feet above the treetops of the forest. "It would tickle me to have a turn with him again. He has forgotten his other beat and is beginning to boast again about what great stunts he means to kick up." "Well, who knows what may be in store for us yet," Frank remarked. "And now, let's head up again and strike for the summit of Old Thundertop, 10 miles away." "Oh!" Andy's sudden exclamation was caused by the report of a gun in among the scattered trees directly below them, and both young aviators distinctly heard the peculiar whine of the bullet as it passed close by their ears, actually making a little hole through the cloth of both planes. End of Chapter 6.